Everyone here listening to this in this room, listening to this, used fossil fuels today. It makes our life, enables modern life in a way that's very different than tobacco. Yet there are some similarities between the tobacco episode and tactics and players. So tell us about that, the similarities and the doubt.
Sure. There are some differences, but there's some similarities. We put out a publication, UCS, called the Climate Deception Dossiers. And just to give you a feel for some of the things that are in there, the story starts a long time ago, but I'll start it in 1995 when the petroleum companies formed a global climate coalition to provide kind of a unified response to the discussions that were ongoing about climate change and what to do about it. And the first thing they did actually was to hire their own scientific team to give them advice on climate change. And that team was headed by the chief scientist of Mobil, and the memo that was provided to the Global Climate Coalition said as follows: the scientific basis for the greenhouse effect and the potential impact of human emissions of greenhouse gases such as CO2 on climate is well established and cannot be denied. Fast forward 3 years, the Kyoto Protocol has now been negotiated and pending before the United States Senate is to ratify the treaty. And the American Petroleum Institute, funded by the same people who were in this global climate coalition, created a global science communication team. Some of the people who were on that team were people who worked for the tobacco industry. And here's what they said their goal was. Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand, and understand is in quotes, uncertainties in climate science. Recognition of uncertainties becomes part of the conventional wisdom. They go on to say, and this sounds a little bit like Spectre from the James Bond movie, unless climate change becomes a non-issue, meaning that the Kyoto proposals are defeated and there are no further initiatives to thwart the threat of climate change, there may be no moment when we can declare victory for our efforts. And in that memo, they detail a public relations strategy, which really has two prongs. One is a great deal of public announcements and op-eds and advertisements trying to claim that there's doubt about climate science. And if you go back in time, you'll see a lot of those types of publications in the late 90s and the 2000s. Ironically, when they say publicly that climate science is uncertain, it turns out that they knew how to read the advice of their chief scientists. They were actually following their scientists' advice about climate change when it came to their own investment decisions about things like offshore oil platforms and pipelines that might freeze in the tundra and warm up due to climate change. So they perfectly understood this, and yet they denied it publicly, and they launched a campaign to cultivate and fund contrarian scientists. One of those scientists is a guy named Willie Soon, whose theory is that solar variability is what causes climate change. Interestingly, that 1995 memo itself said that theory was not valid and couldn't account for climate change. But Mr. Soon got funded to the tune of $1.2 million over a 10-year period, and he had a very interesting funding arrangement. He worked for the Smithsonian, and the deal for his funding was twofold. The companies that funded him, like ExxonMobil, insisted they get the chance to see his publications before they were made public, and they insisted that the Smithsonian agree not to disclose that ExxonMobil was actually funding his work. So there you have it. You have certain knowledge of the risks of climate change. You have the people themselves saying their goal was to create a campaign to sow doubt, and the execution of that. And I guess the point I want to make is that is just the tip of the iceberg. We now have an investigation by the New York Attorney General and the California Attorney General. My prediction is a lot more is going to come out, and this conversation will heat up dramatically over time.
Bill Reilly, you've been on both sides of this as the country's top environmental officer and also a fiduciary officer at an oil company. How do you respond to kind of some of these stories that you've just heard?
Well, one of the priorities that we set at the beginning of my term at EPA was to pay attention to the air problem that hadn't been addressed in any way at all, despite the expenditure of billions of dollars to try to regulate automobiles and factories and utilities and so forth, and that is indoor air. And the Science Advisory Board to EPA was very concerned about that being a source of mortality, morbidity that were really largely neglected. The most significant implicated problem was smoking. And so I declared, this is my last regulatory decision, I declared side stream smoke a Class A carcinogen. And within a very short period of time, you had laws in most of the municipalities in the country that did in fact forbid smoking in publicly accessible space in buildings. So that issue was hard fought. I can recall that it was working its way through the various review bodies at EPA in the midst of the '92 election, and I received a couple of calls telling me how threatening this was to the party in 5 states, and the governors who called for me to be dismissed in connection with that decision. But it had an immediate impact. I think we had some difficulty persuading everybody that was true because the confidence interval we had was 90%. Usually EPA's decisions are 95%. And the reason we had the difficulty was we couldn't find a control group that didn't have evidence of nicotine and smoking in their systems. We finally found some nuns, as I recall, in discalced nuns in a convent in New Mexico, as I recall, and they were largely free of any infection by cigarettes. But the rest of us, those of us who'd never smoked, didn't really matter. We all have evidence of carrying it. Thinking about the oil industry, I remember George W. Bush. I did not serve in that administration. I served in the first President Bush administration. He referred to oil as an addiction at one point. And I remember thinking that, well, how do you deal with an addiction? I'm not aware that we've ever staunched an addiction by cutting off supply. You really got to go to demand. You've got to do the things that change that whole attractiveness of it to someone who's buying. The oil company whose board I served on was the only American company whose CEO joined the United States Climate Action Plan. That's ConocoPhillips. The other two who joined were both were BP and Shell, both foreign companies.
And that was a group of industry and environmentalists trying to craft a central policy on
That's
climate.
right. Come up with a proposal for legislation that would actually regulate carbon, and do it with a cap and trade program. The Environmental Defense Fund, Natural Resources Defense Council, and others were involved with that. So that's not a company that ever was implicated in much of this story, other than producing the product, which continues to be something they do. I think the prospect that we have right now, and a very important one, there is going to be a review, I think this fall, of the President's proposal commitment of the auto industries to support, too, 54.5 mile per gallon automobile fuel efficiency. Once that goes fully into effect, it will result in more than 2 million barrels a day reduction in American consumption of oil. That is a hugely important decision. Every major auto industry company, except for Volkswagen, has supported it. I would think that they, in their present circumstance, might want to reconsider that decision. They have other fish to fry, presumably. But that's hugely important in addressing this entire question.
Well, can I just jump in on this? Because I was actually involved. You were at the top on that 1991 EPA report. I was at the bottom. And that was a tremendously important document, because the EPA identifying secondhand smoke as indoor air pollution just changed the way people thought about the problem from a personal health problem to an environmental problem. And it just transformed the discussion. And the tobacco companies were absolutely terrified of that report. They brought their lawsuits, they did this and that. But they then started a concerted effort to discredit the US EPA. And they created something called the Sound Science Coalition to attack the EPA over the confidence intervals.
They're really good at naming, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, they really are. I mean, I teach statistics, and actually, you did use a 95%, but we don't have time to get into that. But the point was that the tobacco companies by then knew that they had such low public credibility that they couldn't be publicly identified with this Sound Science Coalition. So they reached out to other industries, to the petrochemical industry, to the pharmaceutical industry, to the food industry, a whole range of industries that was potentially threatened by science-based regulation to provide cover for the tobacco companies who were calling all the shots. And then these other companies realized that, oh, hey, this is actually a pretty good idea. And the same people who formed the Sound Science Coalition and set up these, the denier scientists, basically to try to discredit the EPA generally, ended up going to work, not just for tobacco, but for all these other companies and building the whole science denialists. So these things really do, come together very tightly.